The air in my own hardware store hung thick with the scent of sawdust and betrayal. It was Wednesday, 2:15 p.m. My brother, Mike, stood beside a man in a cheap suit, his face a mask of smug pity. "It's done, Stanley," Mike announced to the crowded aisle. "The bank's taking possession. You have 30 days. $400,000 is a lot to default on." His voice was loud enough for Mrs. Gable, picking out gardenias, to hear every single word. The number just hung there, obscene and impossible. A low, cruel chuckle escaped Mike's lips. "What are you going to do, Stan? Start selling nails one by one to pay it back?" He looked around for an audience, and he found one. A few customers stared, frozen in place. Leo, my young part-timer, looked like he'd been struck. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. Mike wasn't just taking the store. He was salting the earth, making sure nothing of my dignity could ever grow back. The situation felt utterly, brutally final. The man in the suit, a Mr. Harris from the bank, dutifully held up a clipboard. Even from behind the counter, I could see the foreclosure notice, the official letterhead, and the amount. $400,000 circled in aggressive red ink. He wouldn't meet my eye. He didn't have to. The document did all the talking. I was cornered, publicly stripped of my life's work. The quiet hum of the key-cutting machine in the back seemed to be mocking me, a sound of a business that was no longer mine. But I didn't rage. I didn't beg. I took a clean rag from beneath the counter and calmly wiped down a small, invisible smudge on the formica. I folded my hands, one over the other, and looked directly at Mike. A small, unreadable smile touched my lips. I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, a momentary crack in his triumphant facade. He expected a storm, a collapse. He was getting a dead, unnerving calm. He didn't know that the game he was playing had rules he'd never even bothered to read. The silence stretched. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, about to deliver the final procedural blow. Mike puffed out his chest, ready for his victory lap. I could feel every eye in the store on me, waiting for me to shatter. I let the moment hang, letting them all believe this was the end, letting them see the finality of my ruin. I was about to speak, but 3 months earlier, on a cold Tuesday morning, it all began with a simple knock on my apartment door. That Tuesday, I was in my apartment above the store, the one I'd lived in for 40 years. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with the faint, comforting smell of machine oil that always drifted up through the floorboards. It was the smell of my entire life. The knock was polite but firm. Outside stood a man who introduced himself as a representative from Sterling Mutual Bank. He was here, he said, to conduct a preliminary property assessment for a loan nearing default. I stared at him, confused. "There must be a mistake," I told him. "This property has been free and clear for 30 years. He offered a sympathetic but rigid smile. "The loan was taken out against the commercial property 2 months ago, Mr. Gable, by Michael Gable, co-owner." He showed me a file number. The world tilted slightly on its axis. Mike, my brother. Co-owner on paper, yes, but he hadn't worked a day in the store in 20 years. I sent the man away, my heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I had to find Mike. I had to understand what he had done. I found him not at his home, but in the back office of the store, a place he rarely entered. He was on the phone, his voice a low, urgent murmur. I saw papers from a high-risk investment firm spread on the desk. When he saw me, he hung up quickly, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "What was that about?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "What did you do, Mike?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Just some business, Stan. Nothing for you to worry your old head about." My eyes scanned the cluttered office, a room full of 4 decades of invoices, memories, and dust. They landed on a small, tarnished brass hook by the door. Hanging from it was a heavy ring of ornate, old-fashioned skeleton keys, the original set from when our father first opened the store in 1958. "Dad never threw anything away," I murmured, mostly to myself. The keys were a silent testament to our history, to the foundation of everything we had. Mike followed my gaze and snorted, the sound full of derision. "Junk," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Like half the stuff in this place. We need to modernize, Stan, not worship relics from the Stone Age. Those keys are worthless. He grabbed them from the hook and tossed them into an old cardboard box, filled with yellowed receipts and dried-up pens. Out of sight, out of mind. His dismissal was so complete, so absolute. He saw only old metal. He had no idea he was throwing away the very history he was trying to sell. Ignoring the keys, I pressed him about the bank. The truth came spilling out, not in a torrent of remorse, but in a flood of entitled justification. I had a hot stock tip. I was going to double the money and pay it back in a week, he said, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, feverish light. It was a sure thing, Stan. We would have been set for life. He didn't see the business our father built. He saw a pile of capital he could leverage for a gamble. The stock tip, of course, had gone bad. Terribly bad. The entire $400,000 was gone, vaporized in the digital ether of the stock market. He'd lost it all. He wasn't apologetic. He was angry, as if the world had somehow cheated him. It's not my fault the market dipped, he snapped, pacing the small office. I did this for us, so you wouldn't have to spend the rest of your life haggling over the price of deck screws. A week later, the first official letter arrived. It was from Sterling Mutual, printed on heavy, intimidating bond paper. It outlined the loan agreement, the principal of $400,000, the astronomical interest rate, and the 60-day window before foreclosure proceedings would begin. The clock had started ticking. 60 days to come up with a fortune I didn't have, to solve a problem I didn't create. The paper felt cold in my hands, a death sentence for the store. At the bottom of the second page was a copy of the signature line. There was Mike's familiar scroll, and next to it, a clumsy, almost childish forgery of my own name, Stanley Gable. It was a poor imitation, shaky and uncertain, but to a bank eager to issue a loan against a valuable, debt-free property, it had been good enough. Seeing my name forged on a document designed to steal my life's work was a deeper cut than any shouted insult. I confronted him again, this time on the main floor of the store, the official letter clutched in my hand. Leo was stocking shelves nearby, and a few customers were browsing. You forged my signature, I said, keeping my voice low. But Mike didn't care for discretion. I had power of attorney, Stan. It's legal, he boomed. You signed it yourself after your knee surgery. It was for your own good. His loud, self-righteous declaration turned every head. The humiliation was a physical heat on my face. My private nightmare was now a public spectacle. The memory of that power of attorney came flooding back. 10 years ago, laid up for months, I'd signed it so Mike could handle the store's payroll and bill payments. It was an act of trust, a brother helping a brother. He had twisted that trust into a weapon, a key to unlock the vault and empty it. Joan, my late wife, had been wary even then. Be careful with documents, Stanley, she'd said. Ink is more permanent than blood. I hadn't listened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The familiar sounds of the old building settling, sounds that had comforted me for decades, now seemed like groans of a dying animal. I walked the dark, silent aisles of the store, running my hand over the cool steel of the tool chests, the rough wood of the hammer handles. I remembered stocking these very shelves with Mike when we were teenagers, our father watching us with a proud smile. We were a team then. The memory was so vivid, it felt like a ghost was walking beside me. The air was thick with the familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil, a scent that had always meant home and hard work. Now, it smelled like a tomb. I saw our reflections in the dark glass of the front door, a stooped old man and the ghost of a smiling boy. How had that boy become the man who would steal it all away? The betrayal wasn't just about money or property. It was a retroactive poisoning of every good memory I had of us. Over the next few weeks, I descended into a bureaucratic hell. I spent hours on the phone with the bank, being transferred from one indifferent department to another. I explained the fraud, the forgery, the abuse of the power of attorney. They were polite but unmoved. We have a legally executed loan agreement, Mr. Gable. was the constant, infuriating refrain. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a name on a defaulting account, an obstacle in their path to acquiring a valuable asset. My personal savings were meager. 40 years of running a small-town hardware store doesn't make you a rich man. It gives you a good life, an honest living, but not the kind of cash needed to fight a bank or pay off a $500,000 debt. I looked at my bank statement. $12,500. It was a laughable sum against the mountain of debt Mike had created. Despair began to set in, a cold, heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. Then, a glimmer of hope. I found a young, hungry lawyer, a man named Ben Carter, who worked out of a small office above a bakery. He listened to my story, his eyes flashing with indignation. "This is outrageous," he said, slamming his hand on his desk. "A clear-cut case of fraudulent conveyance and abuse of fiduciary duty. The power of attorney was for day-to-day operations, not for securing a massive personal loan. We can fight this, Mr. Dable. We can win." For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Hope. It was a feeling so potent, I had almost forgotten what it was like. Ben was confident. He drafted a blistering letter to the bank's legal department and filed for an emergency injunction to halt the foreclosure. He spoke of depositions, of discovery, of putting Mike on the stand and exposing his lies. I allowed myself to believe that the system, that justice, would prevail. The hope lasted exactly 8 days. Ben called me, his voice stripped of all its earlier fire. "I'm sorry, Stanley," he said, the words heavy with defeat. "The bank's lawyers are from a massive firm. They've buried us. They filed a motion to dismiss, and the judge, an old friend of their senior partner, granted it. The legal system I had put my faith in was a closed club, and I wasn't a member. The bank," he explained, "was claiming to be a bona fide encumbrancer for value. A technical term meaning they had no duty to investigate the circumstances. It got worse. Mike's lawyer is arguing that the power of attorney was unrestricted," Ben continued, his voice tired. "And they're countersuing you for legal fees and damages for filing a frivolous lawsuit. They weren't just beating me. They were trying to crush me into dust, to make an example of me. The legal path was a dead end, a trap that would only drain the last of my savings and leave me with nothing but more debt." The despair returned, colder and deeper than before. I hung up the phone. The silence in my small apartment was absolute. Downstairs, the lifeblood of the store hummed on, ignorant of its own death sentence. The 60-day clock was still ticking, now with less than a month to go. I had tried to fight, and I had lost. Mike had won. He had used the law, trust, and our own shared history against me with surgical precision. I was out of options, out of time, and out of hope. All I could do was wait for the end. The day after Ben's call, I began the grim task of packing up my life. 40 years in this apartment, packed into cardboard boxes. It was an act of surrender. I started with the office, the room where Mike had sealed our fate. It felt fitting to dismantle the scene of the crime first. I packed old ledgers, faded photographs of my parents, and employee records dating back to the 70s. Each item was a ghost, a memory of a life that was now officially over. In the back of a deep closet, under a pile of old canvases, was the cardboard box Mike had tossed aside, the one with the yellowed receipts and the keys. I pulled it out, a fine layer of dust puffing into the air. I looked at the heavy ring of old keys he'd dismissed as worthless junk. They lay there dull and forgotten. Seeing them again felt like a punch to the gut. They weren't just metal. They were a symbol of the foundation he'd so easily discarded. A tangible piece of our shared past he'd literally thrown in the trash. I lifted the keys, feeling their cold, substantial weight in my palm. I remember the day my father gave a copy of this set to each of us. I was 20, Mike was 18. "This store is a partnership," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "You look out for it, and you look out for each other, always." Holding the keys now, his words echoed as the most bitter of ironies. Mike hadn't just betrayed me, he had betrayed our father's legacy. My fingers brushed against something stiff at the bottom of the box. It wasn't another receipt. It was a thick vellum envelope, yellowed with age, the flap sealed with hardened wax. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a multi-page document, folded neatly. The top read, Partnership Agreement for Gable & Sons Hardware, March 12, 1958. It was the original, the one our father had drafted with his lawyer when he first put our names on the business. It felt ancient, irrelevant. I almost put it back. It was just another piece of history, another painful reminder. What could a 60-year-old document do against the modern bank's army of lawyers? But I found myself scanning the dense, typewritten paragraphs. It was full of archaic legal jargon, clauses about dissolution, succession, and responsibilities. It was a window into my father's careful, methodical mind. He always believed in getting things right, on paper. And I saw it. A single paragraph on page 3. Unlike the others, this one had a faint pencil line drawn alongside it in the margin, a mark my father used to make when he wanted to emphasize something. It was titled Section 4, Encumbrance of Assets. My pulse gave a strange, unexpected flutter. I read the first line, my eyes struggling to focus on a small type. It was about placing liens or loans against the business. I read the key sentence 3 times, my breath catching in my throat. Furthermore, any loan, lien, or encumbrance of any kind placed against the real property or permanent fixtures of the partnership shall be considered void ab initio, unless the binding agreement is affirmed by the notarized physical signatures of all living partners named herein. All living partners, not one partner with a power of attorney, not a forgery. It required both of us, in person, in front of a notary. The air left my lungs in a rush. It wasn't a glimmer of hope, it was a blinding flash of light. This document didn't just supersede the power of attorney. It rendered it completely irrelevant for this specific transaction. Mike couldn't have mortgaged the property even if I had given him explicit permission in a letter signed in blood. Our father from his grave had built a failsafe into the very DNA of the business. A lock that only 2 keys turned together could open. Everything clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The bank's lawyers had checked the county deed, which listed us as co-owners. They had accepted the power of attorney as sufficient. They had never bothered to ask for the business's founding operational agreement. Why would they? It was a 60-year-old document for a small-town hardware store. They had taken a shortcut, assuming the usual rules applied. They assumed wrong. Their entire $400,000 claim was built on a foundation of sand. A cold, clean clarity washed over me, chasing away the fog of despair. This wasn't a messy, expensive court battle about he said, she said, and forgery claims. This was a simple, brutal matter of contractual fact. The loan was not secured. The bank had made a colossal error. The ticking clock of the foreclosure didn't matter anymore. I was holding a bomb, and the fuse was my decision on when to light it. For the first time, I felt the sharp, unfamiliar thrill of power. I picked up the phone and dialed Ben Carter. He answered on the second ring, his voice flat and tired. "Stanley, I wish I had better news for you, but I don't." I cut him off. My own voice, a low, steady thing I barely recognized. "Ben, I need you to listen very carefully. I found the original 1958 partnership agreement, the one my father wrote." I could almost hear him shrug over the phone, ready to dismiss it. He started to say something about it being outdated, but I didn't let him. "It has a unanimous consent clause, Ben, for any lien against the property." I read the paragraph to him, word for word. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I waited. For 5 seconds. 10. 15. I could hear the faint sound of him breathing, the rustle of papers on his desk as his mind raced. When he finally spoke, his voice was a choked whisper. "Oh my God, Stanley, is it notarized? Is your father's signature on it?" I looked at the last page, a notary seal, crisp and clear even after all these years, and my father's strong, decisive signature right beside it. "Yes," I said, "it is." Ben let out a long, slow whistle. "They're dead," he said, the awe in his voice palpable. "The bank, their security is worthless. This changes everything." But Ben's legal mind was already moving past shock and into strategy. "Don't do anything yet, Stanley," he warned, his voice now sharp and focused. "Don't call the bank. don't confront your brother. We let them proceed. We let them think they've won. We let them walk into the trap themselves. Let them hold their public execution. It will make the reversal that much more definitive. He was right. The humiliation they had planned for me would become their own. The final week was a masterclass in psychological torture. The official notice of seizure was taped to the front glass of the store, the bright red letters a beacon of my failure to the entire town. Old friends and customers came in, offering quiet condolences and sad looks, patting me on the shoulder. Weo, my young employee, offered to work the last week for free. Each act of kindness was a fresh twist of the knife, knowing the truth I was holding back. Mike swaggered in 2 days before the end, a funereal peacock. He put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of feigned sympathy that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Stan," he said, his voice dripping with insincere regret. "But look, when this is all over, I'll see what I can do. Maybe I can convince the bank to give you a little something from the sale. Enough to get a room somewhere." He was offering me scraps from my own table. I just nodded slowly, polishing a brass drawer handle on the front counter. "Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the thought." My placid acceptance infuriated him. It was the one thing he couldn't control. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, his mask of concern slipping. "Are you even alive in there? Don't you get it? It's over. You lost everything." He needed me to be broken. My calmness was denying him the final satisfaction of his victory. That night, the final piece of my resolve clicked into place. I was watering the wilting geraniums in my window box when I heard his voice from the alley below. Mike, on his phone again. "Yeah, he's a ghost, completely broken," he was saying, a note of triumph in his voice. "The bank takes over Wednesday. Once they sell, my half of the cash is free and clear, and I've got this new tech stock. It's a guaranteed 10-bagger. My brother, the gambler, was already betting the money from my grave." And so Wednesday arrived. The air in the store was heavy, thick with the smell of sawdust and impending doom. Right on schedule, at 2:15 p.m., Mike arrived with Mr. Harris from the bank. The stage was set. The audience of curious customers had assembled. It was time for the final act of a play that Mike thought he had written. He strode to the center of the main aisle, ready to deliver his triumphant monologue. We were back where it all began, the moment replaying with crystalline clarity. "It's done, Stanley," Mike announced, his voice ringing with authority. "The bank's taking possession. You have 30 days. $400,000 is a lot to default on." Mrs. Gable froze by the gardenias. Leo looked at the floor. The number hung in the air, heavy and final. But this time I knew it was hollow. I finished wiping the counter and set the rag down. My small, calm smile returned. "It certainly is a lot of money, Mike," I said, my voice carrying easily through the silent store. "That's why it's such a relief that Gable and Sons Hardware doesn't owe the bank a single cent." A confused murmur went through the customers. Mike's face tightened with irritation. He let out a short, sharp laugh. "The old man's finally lost it. He's delusional. Harris, go on, show him the foreclosure documents again. Maybe it'll sink in this time." Mr. Harris, looking increasingly uneasy at this public confrontation, shuffled his papers and held up the official notice again, the red circle around the $400,000, like a bullseye. "That's a notice for a secured loan," I clarified, my voice precise. "And this loan was never legally secured against this property." From beneath the counter, I produced not a rag, but a crisp, clean photocopy of the 1958 partnership agreement. I laid it on the counter, the page with Section 4 facing up. Our father was a very careful man. As if on cue, the bell above the door chimed and Ben Carter entered. He wore a sharp suit and an expression of absolute confidence. He strode to the counter and addressed Mr. Harris, ignoring Mike completely. "As my client has stated, the founding agreement for this partnership requires the notarized signatures of both partners for any lien. Your bank failed in its most basic due diligence. The security interest you believe you hold is, and always has been, void." Ben then turned his gaze, cold and hard, on my brother. "Which means, Michael, that your debt to Sterling Mutual is now a $400,000 unsecured personal loan. Good luck with that." He placed a formal letter on the counter in front of Mr. Harris. This is our notice to immediately remove your invalid lien from my client's title. Mike's face had gone from smug to confused to a pasty, sickly white. The trap had sprung, and his stunned expression was more satisfying than any shouting match could ever be. The color drained from Mike's face. He looked at the document on the counter, then at Ben, then at the banker. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a dawning, frantic horror. "No," he stammered, shaking his head. It can't be. The power of attorney?" Ben cut him off with a chilling finality, was insufficient. "Per the founding charter, which you clearly never read, the loan is yours, Mike. All yours." Mr. Harris, the banker, was now sweating profusely. He snatched up the photocopy, his eyes darting across the text of Section 4. I could see the exact moment the legal and financial implications crashed down on him. His bank hadn't secured a prime piece of commercial real estate. They had given a high-risk, unsecured loan of $400,000 to a failed day trader. His career was flashing before his eyes. He looked at me, no longer with pity, but with a kind of terrified respect. "This is an irregularity," Harris managed to say, his voice strained. "We will have to review this with our legal team." Then smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "You do that, and while you're reviewing, you can also review this." He slid another document across the counter. "It's a formal complaint we'll be filing with the State Banking Commission regarding Sterling Mutual's negligent due diligence procedures. I imagine they'll find it very interesting." Mike finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate cry. "Stanley, you can't. They'll ruin me. We're brothers." He reached across the counter, his hand pleading. "We can fix this. Just tell them you'll sign now. We can refile the paperwork. Please." The shift from predator to begging prey was immediate and grotesque. He saw no irony in appealing to a bond he himself had set on fire. I looked at his outstretched hand, then into his eyes. There was no remorse there, only fear. The same selfish panic that had led him to gamble with my life in the first place. I remembered Joan's quiet wisdom, her gentle warnings about ink and blood. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about consequences. I slowly and deliberately turned my back on him, picking up my rag and resuming my polishing of the counter. Mrs. Gable, by the gardenia display, let out a small gasp. The other customers were no longer trying to hide their attention. They were watching a public unraveling. Leo had a huge, incredulous grin spreading across his face. The public humiliation Mike had engineered for me was now his own, magnified 100-fold. The silence in the store was no longer heavy with my defeat, but with his utter ruin, and took charge. "Mr. Harris," he said in a tone that brokered no argument, "I suggest you and your client's brother take this conversation elsewhere. My client has a business to run." He gestured pointedly towards the door. The banker, looking sick, gathered his papers and practically fled, muttering about contacting his superiors. He didn't even glance at Mike. Mike was the last to move. He stood there, frozen in the center of the aisle, a statue of disbelief. The customers began to part around him, some shooting him looks of pure contempt. He was no longer the powerful brother, the man in charge. He was an obstacle, a fraud, a ghost in a place that had just violently rejected him. He had become what he had accused me of being, irrelevant. Before he left, he delivered one final insult, the desperate, pathetic jab of a defeated man. "You always were a sneaky old bastard, Stanley," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "Hiding behind Dad's old papers. You think he'd be proud of you for this?" It was his last attempt to claim the moral high ground, to paint me as the villain, but the words were hollow, meaningless. He knew, and everyone in that store knew, who had honored our father and who had desecrated his memory. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I simply walked over to the old office. I reached into the cardboard box of history he had declared worthless and pulled out the ring of heavy, ornate keys. They felt solid and real in my hand, a link to the past and the key to the future. I walked back to the brass hook by the door, the one he had stripped them from, and hung them back in their rightful place, the metal making a faint, satisfying chime. The sound of that chime seemed to finally break his paralysis. He stared at the keys, at the symbol of his own arrogant oversight, now hanging as a monument to his failure. Without another word, he turned and stumbled out of the store, the bell on the door mocking him with a cheerful jingle. He walked out of my store, out of my life, and into a new one defined by a $400,000 unsecured personal debt. The store was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Gable broke the silence. "Well," she declared, picking up her gardenias, "I suppose you'll be needing a new brand of wood polish, Stanley. That one seems to have done its job." A few customers chuckled. The tension shattered. Leo came up to the counter, his eyes shining. "That was amazing, Mr. Gable. Just amazing." Then gave me a firm, approving nod. "We'll get the official lien release from the bank within 48 hours, he said. "They won't fight. They'd be insane to let this get to a regulator." He handed me his card. "My fee is on the house, Stanley." It was a genuine pleasure. He had taken the case for the justice of it, a rarity I was profoundly grateful for. After Ben and the last of the customers left, Leo and I stood in the quiet store. The afternoon sun streamed through the front windows, catching dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of sawdust and machine oil was no longer the scent of a tomb. It was the smell of my life, my work, my home. It was the smell of survival. The building felt solid around me again. I walked behind the counter and pulled out the old cash box. I counted out the day's meager earnings. It wasn't much, but it was honest, and it was mine. Every dollar was earned through fair trade and hard work, not through lies and desperate gambles. I finally understood what our father had tried to teach us, that the foundation of a thing is its most important part. Mike had built his life on sand. My father had built this store on rock. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment. The sounds of the street below, a familiar comfort. The foreclosure notice was gone from the front door. The threat was gone. My brother was gone. There was a quiet emptiness in the air, but it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. The weight I had been carrying for months had vanished so completely, it felt like I might float away. I thought about calling my daughter, telling her the whole story, but I decided to wait. This victory was quiet, personal. It wasn't something to be shouted. It was something to be savored, like a glass of good whiskey after a long, hard day. I had faced the abyss, looked into the void of ruin and public shame, and I had not blinked. I had found my own strength in the dusty relics of the past. My gaze fell on a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was of me and Joan, taken on the day we bought the apartment above the store. We were so young, full of plans and anxieties. "This place will be our rock, Stanley," she had said. She was right. It had been, and it still was. I felt her presence in that quiet room, a comforting sense of approval, a silent "I told you so" about being careful with ink. The next morning, 2 days later, a courier delivered a large envelope. It was from Ben's office. Inside, pristine and official, was the lien release from Sterling Mutual Bank. It was a simple document, just a few paragraphs of dense legal text, and I took the document downstairs, through the Awakening store. I didn't frame it. I didn't make a show of it. I simply walked into the back office, opened the heavy, fireproof safe, where my father had kept the most important papers, and placed the lien release inside, right next to the original vellum partnership agreement. I closed the heavy steel door, turned the dial, and heard the satisfying, final click of the tumblers falling into place.